These are the voices and sounds of history. When the world was young, men depicted the story of their conflicts and triumphs on the walls of caves. Later came the printed word. Now we bring you a chronicle of sound, a sound history of our times. Washington, April 1949, and the voice of Harry S. Truman, President of the United States of America.
In this treaty, we seek to establish freedom from aggression and from the use of force in the North Atlantic community.
In Washington, the foreign ministers of 12 free nations were signing the North Atlantic Pact.
It is a simple document, but if it had have existed in 1914 and in 1939, I believe it would have prevented the acts of aggression which led to 2 world wars.
If it had existed then. Come back to London. On an evening in January 1934, and to the voice of H.G. Wells, prophet of the atomic age, prophet of things to come.
A sort of spasm of nationalism has contracted men's minds. The answer to whither Britain amounts practically to this: drifting with the rest of mankind towards catastrophe.
To the helm of that drifting ship came first a Scotsman, Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald.
Peace is the supreme need of the time.
MacDonald flirted with peace. In 1935, his successor, Stanley Baldwin, pursued her with heavy English platitudes.
We shall persist in our attempts to promote peace and disarmament, and I believe that ultimately we shall succeed.
That same year, Britain's well-loved monarch, George V, celebrated the 25th year of his reign and voiced his people's hopes in the first broadcast ever made from Britain's Parliament.
And I pray that we may continue to pursue the cause of freedom and progress in a spirit of peace, tolerance, and understanding.
But while the leaders of democracy talked peace, the dictators of Germany and Italy prepared for war. In 1935, Benito Mussolini mobilized his misguided nation for a savage assault on Abyssinia.
20 milioni a un cuore solo, una volontà sola, una decisione sola.
Aviation was making new conquests of space and time. Years later, men were to curse and bless the achievements of flyers such as Wiley Post, Amy Johnson, and Amelia Earhart.
My flying was done entirely in the cockpit. That is, I depended on instruments alone to tell me the position of my plane in space.
In 1937, the dirigible Hindenburg crossed the Atlantic in less than 48 hours. As the massive airship loomed over its mooring post at Lakehurst, New Jersey, men's faith in these craft seemed to be vindicated. Then, in a split second, came disaster. Listen now to one of the most dramatic records in the history of sound. American radio commentator Herb Morrison is watching the Hindenburg's arrival.
It's starting to rain again. The rain had slacked up a little bit. The back motors of the ship are just holding it just enough to keep it from... It bursts into flames. Keep... Get out of the way. Get it started. It's crashing. It's crashing terrible. Oh, my. Get out of the way, please. It's burning, bursting into flames, and it's falling on the mooring mast and all the folks between it. This is terrible. This is one of the worst catastrophes in the world. Oh, it's place is 20, 400 or 500 feet into the sky, and it's a terrific crash, ladies and gentlemen. The smoke and the flames now, and the flame is crashing to the ground, not quite to the mooring mast. All the humanity and all the passengers screaming around here. I can't talk to people. There's friends around there. I can't talk, ladies and gentlemen.
December the 11th, 1936, and the culmination of a tremendous human drama.
At long last, I am able to say a few words of my own.
A young bachelor king, Edward VIII, is making his choice between personal happiness and an empire's crown.
But you must believe me when I tell you that I have found it impossible to carry the heavy burden of responsibility and to discharge my duties as king as I would wish to do without the help and support of the woman I love.
And so, for the second time in a year from the ancient palace of St. James, a new monarch was proclaimed.
George VI, by the grace of God, of Great Britain and Ireland, and the British dominions beyond the seas, King, Defender of the Faith, Emperor of India.
An empire's crisis had passed, but now a graver crisis threatened the civilized world. Abyssinia had followed Manchuria as a hostage to appeasement. The Rhineland and unhappy Spain were new milestones marking the retreat of the divided democracies from the principles of the League Covenant. And now it was Austria's turn to be engulfed by a ruler inflamed by dreams of world power.
Rückt unter den Jubel! Österreich in unser Land ein! Österreichische Soldaten begrüßen deutsche Gaue!
Speaking in his birthplace, Linz, Adolf Hitler declared that he had now fulfilled his divine mission to return Austria to Germany. Blinkered by apathy and bridled by caution, the democracies plodded through the years of crisis while the Berlin-Rome axis was being forged and tempered for war. In 1938, Hitler decided that the oppressed Germans living in Czechoslovakia's Sudeten territory must be liberated and massed his troops on the frontier. While the Czechs stood firm, Neville Chamberlain flew first to Berchtesgaden, then to Göteborg, then Munich, to seek an accommodation with Hitler. On September the 30th, anxious crowds waited to greet him at Heston Airport.
This morning, I had another talk with the German Chancellor, Herr Hitler. And here is the paper which bears his name upon it as well as mine. We regard the agreement signed last night and the Anglo-German naval agreement as symbolic of the desire of our two peoples never to go to war with one another again.
The next day, Hitler marched, and the Sudetenland trembled under the robot tramp of Nazi jackboots. While Chamberlain and Daladier were debating how the map of Europe should be redrawn, Hitler was redrawing it. A year later, on September the 1st, 1939, Poland's western frontier was rubbed out. Now Britain awoke. An ultimatum was sent at once to the ruler of the Reich. Unless he undertook to withdraw from Poland by 11 a.m. on September the 3rd, a state of war would exist between Britain and Germany.
I have to tell you now that no such undertaking has been received, and that consequently this country is at war with Germany.
It was summer, and it was Sunday. For a few minutes after Chamberlain had spoken, a great quietness settled on the land. Then, children in their schoolrooms, women in their homes, none was to be spared the horror of total war.
I want you to get your knitting out and settle down comfortably at your desks. And then I want to see just how long you can sit there with your gas masks on. And when you're quite quiet, I'm going to read you a story.
But for 8 months, all was quiet. It was the phony war. Then suddenly on May the 10th, 1940, the Nazi High Command released its panzer columns and mobile infantry on neutral Belgium and Holland in a swift thrust towards the undefended frontiers of France. That night, British troops crossed the frontier to meet the Wehrmacht. Three weeks later, the dazed and battered remnants of a gallant army had been swept to the sea. And across the Channel in Britain, a nation prayed for deliverance. Then came the Epic of Dunkirk. Units of the Home Fleet wrote a new and magnificent chapter in naval history. But the real miracle was provided by that great armada of little ships, pleasure boats, paddle steamers, rivercraft, to which J.B. Priestley paid a grateful nation's tribute.
Among those paddle steamers that will never return was one that I knew well, for it was the pride of our ferry service to the Isle of Wight, none other than the good ship Gracie Fields. She has paddled and churned away forever. But now, look, this little steamer, like all her brave and battered sisters, is immortal. She'll go sailing proudly down the years in the Epic of Dunkirk. And our great-grandchildren, when they learn how we began this war by snatching glory out of defeat and then swept on to victory, may also learn how the little holiday steamers made an excursion to hell and came back glorious.
Now Britain stood alone, but with the knowledge that a great empire and commonwealth was ranged alongside her. And from London, nations upon whom the Nazi tyranny had been clamped heard and were comforted by the voices of their leaders in exile. Beneš of Czechoslovakia.
Lidé československý, Češi a Slováci.
Queen Wilhelmina of the Netherlands.
Den schrootbenacht van de stad, benoemd tot de stand.
King Haakon of Norway.
Norske kvinner og menn. Det er med vemodige følelser jeg da taler til det norske.
King Peter of Yugoslavia.
Da živi naša mila otadžbina Jugoslavija, koja će vaskršnuti moćnija no što ikad bila.
Sikorski of Poland.
Rodacy, mówię do was w kulminacyjnym punkcie sukcesów germańskich.
And the voice of General de Gaulle.
J'invite les chefs, les soldats, les marins, les aviateurs.
And in this dark hour, Britain too found a voice to express her determination to stand firm.
Let us therefore brace ourselves to our duty. So bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour.
It is September 1940, and the fields and gardens of Kent are bathed in golden sunshine. But up there, with the blue autumn sky as their arena, Hurricanes and Spitfires of the RAF gave battle to Goering's vaunted Luftwaffe. Through weeks which held the breathless attention of the whole world, the immortal few fought the Battle of Britain from dawn to dusk. They saved Britain from invasion when she was weak, and by saving her, they saved humanity. But now, under cover of the long winter nights, a new ordeal began. An ordeal by fire, by bombs. If you lived in Britain then, you will remember this sound. Out of the heavens, hell came to London. The lethal cargoes were unloaded and the bombers droned back into the dawn. And always over the ruins and tears left behind, the cheerful, irrepressible Cockney spirit of the Londoner reasserted itself. The story of one such Londoner was recorded by another one, cab driver Harry Anderson. It was early morning and the bombers had gone. And then in the silence of a British city, Harry heard a woman singing. He found her surrounded by rubble and broken glass, cleaning her front doorstep.
She was well on the stout side, and she looked as if she'd been the mother of about 8 or 9 kids. She looked the sort who wouldn't leave her house unless she was carried out feet first. You know, as if she'd been born in that district and had all her children there and was determined to stay there, Hitler or no Hitler. And was also quite determined to clean the front door step. Now, I thought to myself, that's the sort of person you can't beat. And then she turned round and she saw me. Now I thought, I'm going to hear something. I'll bet she's going to tell me whether Hitler's mother and father were married. But what she said was, you ain't seen my bleeding milkman round, have you?
In their darkest hour, the British people sought laughter and good fellowship. The BBC brought it to them through the weekly High Gang program of 2 Americans, B.B. Daniels and Ben Lyon.
Hi, gang. Welcome once again to your own High Gang show, coming to you as always from the heart of London, starring B.B. Daniels, Vic Oliver, and Ben Lyon. That's me, folks.
And the best-loved radio personality of all time, the late Tommy Handler.
Well, now, if I make this show a success, it'll be a great boost all round.
Great juice all round, sir. Count me out.
Hello, Colonel. How are you?
But to the members of the underground movements in Europe, the BBC brought a personality of another kind, Colonel Britain. Millions on the continent knew his voice.
You wear no uniforms, and your weapons are different from ours. But they're not less deadly. The fact that you wear no uniforms is your strength. The Nazi official and the German soldier don't know you, but they fear you.
And to these millions was given a new symbol of faith in ultimate liberation.
The knight is your friend. The V is your sign.
The fall of France, the Battle of Britain, the passing by the United States Congress of the Lend-Lease Act, these were the first 3 climacterics of the war. The 4th came at 4 a.m. on June the 22nd, 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. Now, Britain had a tough fighting ally in Europe. 6 months later, America reeled under the shock of Japanese treachery at Pearl Harbor, then flexed its mighty sinews for total war. Before Congress, Franklin Delano Roosevelt pledged his faith in a victory that he never lived to see.
No matter how long it may take us to overcome this premeditated invasion, the American people in their righteous might will win through to absolute victory.
Now it was global war. Swept from Malaya, Burma, and the Pacific Islands by the first fierce tidal wave of Japanese militarism, the democracies regrouped their land, sea, and air forces, while the great arsenal of America forged and sharpened the weapons of retribution. And on March the 21st, 1942, a new comradeship in arms was declared at Spencer Street Station, Melbourne, by General Douglas MacArthur.
I am glad indeed to be in immediate cooperation with the Australian soldier. I know him well from World War days and admire him greatly.
On the other side of the world, in Britain, war workers on the production front sang with new heart at their benches and lathes. Deep in a Surrey wood one night, the BBC set up its microphone to capture the song of the nightingale. The engineer's vigilance was rewarded, and then a grim new meaning was given to the words of the Greek poet Callimachus. Thy nightingales live on, I hear them sing. E'en death spares them, who spares not anything. In the background is the sound of death. Death airborne by 1,000 British bombers droning out to strike at the heart of Hitler's Reich. Listen now to a recording made inside a Lancaster bomber as it weaves over the German capital. Through the intercom, the crew is reporting its battle with a German night fighter.
Where is he, rear gunner? Can you see him? Down! 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 He's shot down! He's shot down! Did you shoot him down? Yeah, he's got him, boy. Right in the middle. Bloody good.
But now, 2,000 miles to the south, Rommel stood with his Afrika Korps at the gates of Cairo, and famine threatened the besieged Mediterranean fortress of Malta. Suddenly, a new spirit swept through Britain's 8th Army. The officers caught it first when they assembled at Army headquarters on August the 13th, 1942, to hear their new commander, General Montgomery.
Here we will stand and fight. There will be no further withdrawal. I have ordered that all plans and instructions dealing with further withdrawal are to be burnt, and at once. The great point to remember is that we are going to finish with this chap, Rommel, once and for all. It'll be quite easy. There's no doubt about it. He is definitely a nuisance. Therefore, we will hit him a crack and finish with him.
The sounds you are listening to now are the sounds of the 8th Army's artillery barrage blasting open at El Alamein, a triumphant road that led on to Tripoli and Rome. Then came that great day for which an enslaved continent had waited and prayed. For months, the quiet lanes and ports of southern England had absorbed a vast concentration of men and weapons. Behind locked doors in London, service commanders and scientists had planned and replanned the greatest amphibious invasion in military history. When all was ready, the quiet voice of Ike Eisenhower heralded D-Day 1944.
People of Western Europe, a landing was made this morning on the coast of France by troops of the Allied Expeditionary Force. This landing is part of the concerted United Nations plan for the liberation of Europe.
In Nazi-occupied Paris, patriots heard that voice and were to remember it 3 months later when the capital greeted its liberators. But El Alamein, Rome, Paris, Brussels are milestones. Between them, men died, whole towns and villages were wiped out, and new epics were written into the annals of military fame. At Arnhem, for 8 days, the 1st Airborne Division clung desperately to a bridgehead ringed and pulverized by Nazi guns, mortars, and bombs. If you want to know what hell sounds like, listen to this recording made at Arnhem itself by one of the men who came back, BBC correspondent Stanley Maxted.
You can hear the kind of flak that those planes are flying through. It's absolutely like hail up there. These enemy guns all around us are just simply hammering at those planes. But so far I haven't seen any of them hit. But the bundles are coming down. The parachutes are coming down. That's all that these men ask.
In London, the last robot plane had dipped its warhead and dived from the sky. One final trick was to be pulled out of the bag of perverted Nazi science before the British people knew the peace of friendly skies. The V-2 outstripping sound in its lightning plunge from the stratosphere. But now the Allied armies were chasing the shattered Wehrmacht across the Rhine.
We're in. The Buffalo dips its nose down the bank, and now it's opening up full power. 3 minutes to go, and we are racing across. And side by side with us go racing the other Buffaloes, racing for that hell on the other side. The searchlights cast a white beam now right across the river on one side of us, but ahead of us is only red water. The current's carrying us down, and we're putting up our nose against it, going clean across it all the time. And the tracers making a path on either side of us, beating down the opposition.
Deep into Nazi Germany plunged the racing columns of mechanized armies. And as they advanced, they tore aside veils that had shielded the worst of Hitler's infamies from outside eyes. A wave of horror swept across the civilized world when the armies of liberation reached the gates of Belsen, Auschwitz, Dachau. Out of the nightmare of those charnel houses, the living shells of decent men tottered into the arms of wives and mothers. And humanity bowed its head in shame.
Das war so eine schwere Zeit für mich. Und ich freue mich, dass ich euch alle gesund und munter wiedersehe. Alle Freunde und Bekannte, alle Genossen, ja, es wird wieder gut. Mami, Mami.
At 2:41 a.m. on May the 7th, 1945, the land, sea and air forces of Nazi Germany surrendered unconditionally to the Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe. In Germany, Hitler's new order that was to last 1,000 years had gone the way of all tyrannies, and the brain that conceived it rotted amongst the ashes of the Berlin Chancellery. In Italy, the tragic-comic figure of Mussolini dangled by the heels from a lamppost as grotesque in death as he had been in life. In Europe, democracy's long and bitter death struggle had been rewarded with victory. And as Winston Churchill told the milling, joyous crowd in Whitehall that day,
This is your victory. Victory of the cause of freedom is ever there. In all our long history, we have never seen a greater day than this. God bless you all.
later the warrior leader came out in his blue siren suit onto a balcony in Whitehall to conduct the vast crowd in the singing of Land of Hope and Glory. Nor did London forget the military leaders who had planned and executed their deliverance. On June the 12th, General Eisenhower, now a freeman of the City of London, spoke to his fellow citizens from the balcony of the Lord Mayor's residence.
Whether or not you know it, I am now a Londoner myself. I've got just as much right to be down in that crowd yelling as you have. The great difference that I see in this city and when I came 3 years ago is right here. We can now have crowds. There can be happy gatherings. You don't have to listen for a motor in the sky and wonder whether there's a pilot in the blankety-blank thing or not.
But there was one great leader who could not receive the salute of the free peoples on VE Day. The man whose belief in Britain when she stood alone shone out like a beacon of hope throughout the dark days. The man who, while London gasped and burned under Hitler's Blitz, sent a testament of faith to Winston Churchill.
Sail on, O ship of state. Sail on, O Union, strong and great. Humanity, with all its fears, with all the hopes of future years, is hanging breathless on thy fate.
In St. Paul's Cathedral on April the 17th, 1945, a nation paid tribute to the memory of Franklin D. Roosevelt.
And now the procession has reached the west door, and the great congregation itself begins to file out. And from the belfry above, the muffled peals of bells rings out over the city of London, the London that knows its debt to the man it mourns today. Those peals will be echoed this morning from belfries throughout the land, and all will be sounding like these bells of St. Paul's Cathedral in a nationwide tribute, and above all, for those who hear them, in warm and affectionate memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President of the United States of America.
When, at midnight on August the 14th, 15th, 1945, Britain's Prime Minister came to the microphone to announce the surrender of Japan, the voice we heard was the voice not of Winston Churchill, but of Clement Attlee.
Yesterday, the Japanese, the last of our enemies, whose ambitions plunged the world into so much bloodshed and misery, signed the terms of surrender in Tokyo.
Without waiting for total victory, the British people had started a new political chapter in their island's history. From the War Cabinet, Winston Churchill had turned to the hustings of a general election to conduct a lively and hard-hitting campaign.
Socialism is in its essence an attack not only upon British enterprise, but upon the right of an ordinary man or woman to breathe freely without having a harsh, clumsy, tyrannical hand clapped across their mouths and nostrils.
Socialist leader Clement Attlee, Churchill's right hand during the war, gave his answer from the left.
We need a planned location of industry to give a balance to the country and to preserve social capital. We must have no more distressed areas. No one of these things can be effected without giving power to the government. The Prime Minister made much play last night with the rights of the individual and the danger of people being ordered about by officials. I entirely agree that people should have the greatest freedom compatible with the freedom of others. But there was a time when employers were free to work little children 16 hours a day.
When the ballots were counted, a revolution, peaceful but profound, had been ushered in. 5 months later, in Nuremberg, the leaders of another kind of revolution were arraigned before the bar of world justice to answer for their crimes against humanity. Hermann Goering was the first to plead not guilty.
Bevor ich die Frage des Gerichtshofes beantworte, ob ich mich schuldig oder nicht schuldig bekenne, you must plead guilty or not guilty. Ich bekenne mich im Sinne der Anklage nicht schuldig. Rudolf Hess.
Nein.
That will be entered as a plea of not guilty.
For a year, the trial moved along its ponderous legalistic course. Then came the judgment.
Defendant Hermann Wilhelm Goering, on the counts of the indictment on which you have been convicted, the International Military Tribunal sentences you to death by hanging. Defendant Rudolf Hess.
And on through a list of names that once spelt power and terror in Europe. Keitel, Rosenberg, Frank, Funk, Streicher. One name, the most hated of them all, was not on that list. A mild-looking schoolmaster, Heinrich Himmler, creator of the dreaded Gestapo, cheated justice with a phial of cyanide. A British sergeant major saw him die.
After a struggle lasting a quarter of an hour in which we tried all methods of artificial respiration, under the direction of the doctor. He died. And when he died, we threw a blanket over him and left him.
While the free world was squaring its account with the war criminals at Nuremberg, Britain dealt with a traitor whose sardonic voice had taunted her when she stood alone.
Germany calling. Germany calling. We are continuing our news in English.
William Joyce, radio puppet of propaganda minister Goebbels, was brought back to a city that his Nazi masters had condemned to death. And with the final rejection of his appeal against the death sentence, Lord Haw Haw's voice became a sordid memory.
Germany calling. Germany calling. Germany calling.
At last, Britain had answered. Now an empire that had shared the sacrifice of war turned to cultivate the fruits of peace. And to the Union of South Africa and the Rhodesias came the British royal family, personifying the intimate relationship that linked a far-flung Commonwealth with the mother country. It was a happy tour, radiating friendship, kinship, and song. And overshadowed, as King George VI himself put it in a speech at Pretoria, only by the grave industrial crisis that was then paralyzing the mother country.
And the only unhappy memory that I shall have of them will be due to my constant anxiety about the cruel ordeal which the people of Great Britain have undergone since I left them at the end of January.
During this tour, Princess Elizabeth, heir to the throne, came of age and broadcast this solemn dedication to the Commonwealth.
I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of our great imperial family to which we all belong.
The family was growing up. 3 of its members, India, Burma, and Ceylon, now grown to adulthood, were restless for independence. And with the mingled pride and regret of the eternal parent, Britain handed them the key of the door. On June the 3rd, 1947, a great Indian leader and patriot, Jawaharlal Nehru, broadcast his acceptance of the British government's formula for the transfer of power.
We are little men serving great causes, but because the cause is great, something of that greatness falls upon us also. Mighty forces are at work in the world today and in India, and I have no doubt that we are ushering in a period of greatness for India.
And 2 months later, the last Viceroy of the British Raj, Lord Mountbatten, was ceremonially sworn in at New Delhi as the first Governor-General of a self-governing Indian dominion.
I, Louis Francis Albert Victor Nicholas, Viscount Mountbatten of Burma, do swear that I will and truly serve His Majesty, King George VI, his heirs and successors, in the office of Governor-General of India.
As the year drew to a close, India's new Governor-General flew to take his part in the pageantry of a royal romance that thrilled Britain and the world. A young princess stood beside her sailor bridegroom in Westminster Abbey while the Archbishop of Canterbury joined them in marriage.
Forasmuch as Philip and Elizabeth Alexandra Mary have consented together in holy wedlock and have witnessed the same before God and this company, and thereto have given and pledged their troth either to other, and have declared the same
by giving and receiving of a ring and by joining of hands, I pronounce that they be man and wife together in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. Amen.
It was spring, and the war was a 3-year-old memory when the Duke of Edinburgh took his bride and future queen on an official visit to Paris. They won the city's heart, and as the Duke of Edinburgh told a Mansion House audience on his return to London,
"Wherever we went, we were given an extremely cordial and kindly reception. Part of that welcome may have been for us personally. At any rate, we like to think so. But we are both convinced that the crowds who greeted us were expressing, through us, their friendship for our countrymen."
But to Paris, London, and Lake Success that year came visitors of another kind, intractable men from the Kremlin, dedicated, it seemed, to the perpetuation of ill faith between the nations. Patiently, democracy's representatives at UNO had labored to build a new peace out of the ruins of World War II, to pool the world's resources for the massive tasks of reconstruction. Under its auspices, the Jewish people had won back a national home in Palestine after 2,000 years of exile. On May the 23rd, 1948, Dr. Weizmann, president of the new State of Israel, spoke with pride of its new beginnings.
We have built up several institutions of high culture in Jerusalem. We have a university, we have a great hospital, we have a great nurses' school.
But over it all, reducing debate to a farce, hung a new weapon, the veto. While UNO drifted from deadlock to stalemate, the pulse of European economy beat ever fainter. And the red tide of communism spread through the Balkans and westwards to lap menacingly against the tidal wall of social democracy. Europe was sick and infected. At Harvard University in June 1947, Secretary of State George Marshall had prescribed the remedy.
The truth of the matter is that Europe's requirements for the next 3 or 4 years of foreign food and other essential products, principally from America, are so much greater than her present ability to pay that she must have substantial additional help or face economic, social, and political deterioration of a very grave character.
The Marshall Plan, America's answer to the challenge facing the free world, was conceived at Harvard that day. Marshall Aid sped the wheels of Europe's productive machinery, and it did something else. It gave the Western nations, for the first time in history, common tasks to work for and common interests to defend. The first major test of the Western powers came on June the 28th, 1948, when the Soviet Union clamped her blockade on Berlin. For 318 days and nights, a never-ending supply of food, fuel, and other essentials was flown over the blockade and into Berlin. 190,000 individual flights by British and American planes brought more than 1.5 million tons to the capital's isolated western zone. European confidence in the might of the democracies was restored. And then, a year after the inception of Marshall Aid, came a new comradeship in defense, the North Atlantic Pact, signed by 12 free nations of the Western world. In Washington, Foreign Secretary Ernest Bevin spoke for Britain.
At last, democracy is no longer a series of isolated units. It has become a cohesive organism determined to fulfill its great purpose.
Is the pact a new milestone in humanity's arduous trek towards sanity and peace? Or is it just another fortress against a new dragon of war? The sounds of time will answer. Men can live secure in friendship, competing only in the arts and sports of peace. And men of all nations can sing together as they sang on that brilliant summer afternoon in August 1948 at the opening of the Olympic Games in London.